Good morning and greetings from the AME Zion Church of Kingston. I hope everyone is entering this new year well. When Reverend Heather asked me to preach, I said at first, who, me? I'm used to public speaking, but when you say preach, there's another level there. And being at the pulpit, and in the pulpit, I was like, okay, I'll give this a try. But I do love speaking across New York State to all different groups and all different audiences because I get to connect with people and share, and I get to hear more and more how we're all connected. I've been with the New York State Council of Churches as its Deputy Executive Director with the Reverend Peter Cook, who's the Executive Director, for just about 1 year. So when I hear Chris is celebrating a 1-year anniversary, I'll be here 1 year on January 17th. And in that 1 year, I have learned a great deal in speaking with faith communities across New York State. But I also serve as the project manager, as Reverend Heather was saying, of the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative. And so housing is something that's very important to me. I'm a housing organizer, and I go a little bit more into how I came to be and why it's so important to me a little bit later in the sermon. So I've had, again, an opportunity in this year to see all of the good works that is happening here at the Westminster Presbyterian Church, from the Focus Breakfast program to the many community groups that meet here throughout the week. And so it's a beautiful thing, and I do love the way that the church serves the community. I was hired partly because I am an advocate, and I have been an advocate since I was 7 years old. It really started when I began coming up to the Hunger Action Network lobby days, which would seek to increase the hunger and nutrition budgets and public assistance budgets for families in need. My mom, who was also an advocate for the homeless in New York City, would bring us every year on the bus trip, and we would come up from Kingston to Albany. And everything back then seemed so big. The buildings were big, the people were big, the problems were big. Well, as an adult, the buildings are still big. The people, not so much if I'm wearing heels, especially. Then the problems, well, they seem big, but when you really think about it, they aren't. Because at least the solutions to them are so simple. Or they should be. For example, one example is homelessness and housing insecurity. When you really think about it, humanity has struggled with this problem for centuries. Our Lord Jesus Christ's nativity story starts out with a family seeking shelter, finding none, and where Mary had to give birth in a stable, the humblest of places for the King of Kings. I selected Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 through 20, because it drives home the very real struggle of our Lord and connects with over 100,000 New Yorkers who are themselves experiencing homelessness, sleeping outside, yes, even in the winter, in shelters, in hotels, or on a friend's couch. So when Jesus says, even the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of God has nowhere to lay his head. What I hear is that God did not intend for man to be homeless. He provided homes for all other things who are living in nature, but man has sought to create conditions around housing that are unnatural. Jesus' questioning of why nature can find a way to provide for every fox or bird, but man cannot, is something that we have to carry with us today. Frankly, I had this question because when I was small and I was 7 years old and watching politicians twist and turn to explain why they could not help poor families afford more nutritious food or increase the shelter allowances. As an adult and as a housing activist and organizer, I wondered the very same thing. Why was it so hard to provide a basic need like housing? I found that the answer is that it isn't. The solutions to homelessness and housing and insecurity is very simple. It's housing. But the actual problem is who wants to provide that, and who wants the homeless and those who are housing insecure to be around them. In other words, the problem is us. In my hometown of Kingston, New York is the prime example. It's a small city, maybe 30,000 people. I'm being generous here. In 1994, IBM, its largest employer, left, and the area was economically devastated. In its wake, the city began marketing to wealthier individuals from the city to come up and who were themselves actually being priced out of New York City. They were able to come to Kingston and easily afford our most expensive homes. And they had the resources to fix up our dilapidated but more affordable homes. And when they would purchase multifamily homes, they would kick out low-income residents who were paying what were our market rate prices, but were not enough to afford a New York City lifestyle. So almost overnight, Kingston's homeless population increased. It more than doubled. Its affordability plummeted, and our vacancy, homes that were available to rent, disappeared. There was no place for the poor. Kingston became a gentrified city that had no place for the people who were there to find home. So I joined with others in the community to create the Kingston Tenants Union, and we'll get to how it became the real Kingston Tenants Union as well, to help fight for greater housing affordability and vacancy, and to keep families who had lived there in Kingston for generations, but didn't have the resources to keep them in the city. However, it quickly became apparent that the problem was not just one of affordability or even vacancy, but there was a problem of a lack of will on the part of those who were housed but had power. It became evident that during the pandemic, when the city fought tooth and nail against housing the homeless in tiny homes, which we as a group, along with others, had proposed. We actually came up with a petition of 1,200 people to request tiny homes. We actually gathered and we got a grant for $200,000. That was an initial investment to create a small pilot village. We gathered together all of the nonprofit organizations who were willing to pitch in, these tiny homes would act as non-congregate housing or an alternative to the shelter system during the pandemic and beyond. It would also keep Kingston's homeless in the city of Kingston, particularly in Midtown Kingston. This idea was repugnant to some. The project could not be approved because the people had to share bathrooms. The homes people who were housed said were too small. They said they lacked dignity. Ultimately, the city said the project wouldn't meet zoning, lot, and size requirements and would thus be illegal. So instead of helping the homeless, the city chose to help a private hotelier to build 33 tiny homes under 400 square feet in a floodplain on the waterfront that charged up to $650 per night. That apparently had dignity. The unhoused were sent to the warming center when temperatures dipped below 32 degrees and were separated, had separated sleeping spaces with a plastic sheet that also apparently had dignity. The homeless who found places for themselves or chose to camp rather than to live in a communal setting and risk COVID found that the city had the police slash their tents and throw away all their possessions to clean out their encampments. So if you were lucky enough to be placed or housed by the Department of Social Services, what happened is you were placed outside of Ulster County. Being evicted meant an eviction from the city of Kingston, being pushed into other counties, such as Greene County. There is one such place called the Rainbow Inn, which is in Catskill, New York, which is 30 miles from Kingston. And we would go to the Rainbow Inn. There are families with school-aged children there, and they would have a 30-mile commute to school. So there were 5-year-olds with a 30-mile commute to kindergarten. Of course, we as advocates thought this was wrong, and we endeavored to really find out what the needs of the communities in the shelter system and in the hotels needed. And so one of the things that they asked for was this non-congregate shelter or non-congregate housing, the tiny homes. Whatever it was, they wanted to try to stay and remain in the communities where they had come from. So we literally had to protest in the streets. Jesus used a bullwhip to go into the temple. We used a bullhorn to go into the halls of the legislature and to literally say affordable housing was needed. Until that time, there had been a lot of, ignoring of the issue by those in power. But once we did that, affordable housing became the issue of the moment, of the day, and people began to pay attention. So advocates literally protested in the streets, in the chambers, anywhere and everywhere to get the attention of those in power and to really actually start to build affordable housing for those who they clearly wanted to push out. So the county ended up buying a boarding home, a former boarding home, and taking up the project to fix it up for the families that were in Catskill. And so that project is still ongoing, but that took a lot of advocacy and still takes some advocacy in order to push to get that done. Our advocacy helped to push the county to take over a hotel and to turn it into, it's still being turned into, 100 units of housing for the homeless and frail and elderly, supportive housing. So in that respect, the advocacy really helped and worked to bring about change. However, this housing is still manifesting itself, and as our political systems change, the level of will changes as well. So we in the public sphere have to keep the pressure up and have to keep the pressure on and let them know that this is still something that our community wants and needs. So in Kingston, even the foxes had holes and the birds had their nests, but the people did not have housing. Nature was providing, but man was not. And you know what? Many people in Kingston actually did believe, and still do believe, that the government was providing. It was doing everything it could. That they had a fully funded nonprofit organization to provide shelter. They had a warming center. They had placed families in hotel rooms. They were doing everything they could. But they weren't doing something that was most basic. They weren't doing something that caused them the most discomfort, and that is engaging with the directly impacted, engaging with the homeless, asking them what they needed. Everything is from the top down, what we think they need. As advocates, our job was to ask the unhoused, our job was to advocate for tiny homes, not because we thought it was a great idea or because it was trendy, but because this is what we were hearing, and to amplify that message in any and every space that we were in. And in a way, we are all advocates. Even if we are doing good things, we can talk to those around us, those who are not doing things, those who are doing some things and not others, or not doing anything at all, or have hardened their hearts. We can talk to them. We don't all have to take a bullhorn and bust into a chamber and do all these types of things, but we can act in our own way and reach out to our neighbors, reach out to our friends in any spaces that we're in, and find ways to push that message and ask, how are the homeless, how are those who are unhoused being treated? What do they need? Who's in this room, who's in this space, this conversation that should be included? That's one thing that we can do, and that when we think about the Bible and we think about the lessons that are coming out of Matthew 8:20, it's not saying that we have to build or we have to do this only ourselves. It's saying that we have to carry this message across the seas. We have to carry this message near and far So each and every single one of us, in whatever capacity we're in, has the ability to act, has agency. And even if it's as small as whispering or saying, what about this? What about that? So here we are on Martin Luther King Day weekend, and we are really asking ourselves, how can we build the beloved community that Dr. King envisioned? Dr. King envisioned a community built by agape love, a broad love that didn't recognize color, didn't recognize creed, didn't have all of these barriers. It was a love that cared about your fellow man, your fellow neighbor, because they were a person of God, an image of God. So how can we be a part of that team, that construction team, if you will, in building that beloved community? It is by speaking to your neighbor, even one you have a difference with, and connecting with them, and speaking about issues in your community that are part of or include the unhoused. So Martin Luther King Day weekend, we must remember that his work extended beyond civil rights to economic justice. It's not merely about providing a home or providing a space. It's about ridding the inequality that means there is homelessness, that means there are people who have or who are going without. That is something that is deeper, it's structural, and it requires us to have a constant awareness and a constant need to tell the word and to preach to others, no matter where it is. So Martin Luther King recognized that housing was not only a matter of civil rights, but also of a crucial aspect of economic empowerment. He advocated for policies that addressed disparities, including housing inequality, housing, and how it was impacting communities of color. New York State has one of the sharpest, Albany itself has actually one of the sharpest racial disparities around housing and home ownership. Actually, Albany County is one of the highest, has one of the highest disparities in the nation around housing, housing ownership, Black housing ownership, and housing. So that is something, it's right here in the atmosphere where an impact can be done. And it's your own way of doing that kind of activism, of having those kind of conversations of how it can be done. But a community has to change, and it changes one person at a time. And so, just like Dr. King, the Bible goes beyond merely acknowledging inequality, homelessness, and hunger, but also calling on us. In Luke says, "But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." So in that, he's saying that basically, if we take up this cause, then it will benefit our whole community. Everything, everyone will benefit. There is no con to housing the homeless. There is no drawback to housing the homeless. So even if we are doing a lot, it is not just enough that we rest at that. We must bring others along. We must have those tough conversations. We must pull people closer. And this is something my mom actually taught me, or tried to teach me as I was growing up. She used to go around New York City. So we were homeless, we were unhoused, we were living in what were considered some of the worst welfare hotels in New York City. We were in the Prince George and the Martinique. Those were dangerous, and it was the 1980s. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but there's the 1980s. And so those conditions were very dangerous. But my mom would go out, and she would go, particularly in snowstorms or rainstorms, to check up on those who were unhoused, those who had either mental health issues or other conditions where they did not want to go into shelters. And so she would ask them, did they have what they need? Did they know a storm was coming? And she would tell them about other resources. And she actually worked with what was the Homeless People's Union in New York City, which at that time was part of a revitalization of the Poor People's Campaign. And then there's another Poor People's Campaign now in New York State. But this was back during the 80s and the kind of second revitalization. And we would go with her, and then one day my mom had taken a picture of a woman in a doorway. And to me it looked very dark and underexposed. I really couldn't see anything but an exit sign. And I was like, Mom, you keep this picture around. Why do you have this picture? And my mom was like, because this was a homeless woman who refused to go into a shelter because they would force her to take a medication that she felt disabled her or made her in a disabled state. And after this snowstorm, she actually froze to death. And so for the longest time, we had this picture around the house, and I honestly couldn't see the woman that she was telling me about. And then one day, I was actually in grad school when it happened, I just stared at the picture, and I saw her. And it wasn't that she wasn't there the whole time. It was that it took me all of this time advocating, all of this time learning, and all of these experiences of looking for people who are intentionally hiding themselves to be able to see her. And so in a way, we are blind until we have that cover ripped off and we can see the actual needs of those around us. And so I still have the picture, it's underexposed, but I see her. And I pray that we all get to the point that we can see the true needs of others. There may be a person who is, they may have an addiction. They may have another issue or something. If you're not attuned, you can say that person doesn't want help, that person doesn't want housing. And I've been in many spaces and many places with many people, well-meaning people, who have that belief. It's important to dispel that belief wherever you go. It's not that that person and their activity is the issue. That is an issue. That will get done. There are places that help people who are in recovery. But we need to say, despite that, they need shelter. Despite that, they need love. Despite that, we need to reach out. It's not about them. It's about us as a community, as a society. What links are we willing to go to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves? Thank you. Well, I didn't want to risk, because I am from the Amy Zion tradition. And before that, my family were actually from the Baptist tradition. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher, so I don't want to go on too long. But I did want to leave that, some action steps, that we can take. The New York State Council of Churches and the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, we're actually having a advocacy day, ecumenical and interfaith advocacy day, on March 18th and 19th, and we're going to be here at the Westminster Presbyterian Church for the first part of the day on the 18th. We bring in elected officials, and we have these forums, and it's really a wonderful experience, and we get to talk to elected officials on a kind of one-on-one basis and ask questions, invite them really into God's house and humble them, because ultimately there's a higher authority. And so the other thing is on the 19th, we go down to the Capitol and we go and we do lobbying. I got quite good at lobbying almost accidentally. I did a fellowship and I just started doing it. But it was what I had been doing all along when I was advocating for the Hunger Action Network when I was 7. So it was natural. And so I teach training on how to talk to your elected officials. If you have never done that, do not be afraid. They're just like you and I, and they're responsible as an elected official to talk to their constituents and to listen to their constituents. Not just be there and go, yeah, but to listen. And we can really do that by, having contact with them, talking to them, inviting them into the church, inviting them wherever you are into your events, and letting them know that we see those who they may not see, and that we're going to speak up for those people, no matter what, no matter where, because we see them and we hear them. And so with the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, we also have an open house coming up on January 18th. It's a virtual, and you can learn more about that on our website. And we help churches across, faith organizations across New York State repurpose their properties to actually build affordable housing. So these are, if you have an extra parking lot, if you have a land, which there are a lot of churches who have a lot of land, but may not necessarily have a utility for it at the moment, that can be repurposed and turned into housing for those in the community who need it. And ways you can, again, to act, not only if you have a property and you can build something, but you can work with other churches. So if you don't have that, another church may, join together and see how you can support each other to create that. There's lots of ways that we can work together to support the community and to create new avenues of equality. With that, I'm going to say thank you, Reverend Heather. Thank you for having me here. Again, I do love speaking to faith communities because there isn't a profit motive. Sometimes when you go into spaces or places and you speak with elected officials or you speak to developers, or there's always something there. But our motivation is God. Our motivation is love. Our motivation is that we want to connect with one another because we know that God is love and God is good. And that when we're doing these things and when we're acting in these ways, it's because we're living out God's mission and God's word for us. So thank you.